What's happening, ladies and gentlemen? Acronator here, and welcome to the third episode in this mini-series covering the basics of how to get started and gain experience in the production side of Overwatch Esports. If this is somehow the first video of the series you've seen, and are curious about who this information is meant for and what my qualifications are to be talking about such topics, I would point you towards the introductory video that came out earlier this week. The link to the entire series can be found in the description, which includes basics to play-by-play and color casting, if that sounds interesting to you as well. With all of that out of the way, let's dive straight into it. Before we go too far in, I would like to give the disclaimer that I will not be going over the vast majority of OBS settings you might need to stream an Overwatch tournament match. This is mostly because every production crew does things a little bit differently compared to the rest, and they will usually take the time to explain their personal procedures when you join. I will mention briefly what kind of scenes you should expect to have in OBS for different circumstances that can happen during a broadcast, but for the most part I'm going to be discussing things inside of the game itself. Streaming, observing, and producing are essentially all synonyms when it comes to Overwatch Esports production. Their roles overlap, and oftentimes you'll be wearing many of those hats at the same time when working with smaller community crews. The streamer is quite literally the person controlling the overlays for the broadcast and making sure the information being shown to the viewers is accurate. The observer is essentially the camera operator who's seeing the exact perspective the stream will receive, and the producer is in charge of coordinating with the casters and lobby hosts to make sure that the broadcast goes as smoothly as possible. It does take a lot of know-how and quick thinking to fill this role, as you will be the primary person responsible for fixing any technical difficulties that come up during the stream. As previously stated, smaller communities often have one person to fill all three of these roles, while larger production crews that actually do this as a business will usually have a producer and streamer filled by the same person, while the observers will be separate people. It might sound intimidating to have to do so much at once, but in all reality, when you're starting out, you just have to focus on the fundamentals. Minor mistakes are easily forgiven and quickly forgotten by the audience, and most of the smaller details will get easier once you gain more experience. There's a few major aspects starting out as a streamer, most of which will revolve around what you're showing on the screen, and the rest involves communication with the rest of your broadcast crew. Before every stream, you should make sure that you're caught up to speed on what OBS settings you should have for your particular production crew, as well as how their streaming kit functions. Depending on the community, your kit can range from very simple to surprisingly complex. In all odds, you'll need some time to practice and get comfortable with the tools at your disposal, so make sure you're confident before you ever volunteer to cover a game. Likewise, don't be afraid to ask your production head questions about what's expected of you. There's a 99% chance they'll be happy to answer. Some general OBS scenes I would recommend having at your disposal are a starting soon screen, a screen for in-between maps that shows the current score of the series, an overlay for the game itself, a be right back screen in case there's a short break or technical difficulties, and finally a thanks for watching screen at the end of the broadcast. Some production crews will be more creative than others and provide a wide variety of options to show in between maps, but these are the basic types of scenes you can expect to see in most production kits. Your in-game graphical settings don't really matter as long as they meet the bare minimum requirements for whatever the production crew you're working with is. As long as the game doesn't look like a fried potato and you can get it consistent 60 FPS, it really doesn't matter. One setting I would highly recommend, however, is to set your in-game master volume to 30. I've personally found that this is the sweet spot between being able to hear the game audio without it ever threatening to overpower the casters. If you've watched through either of the previous videos in this series covering the different styles of casting, you'll likely already have heard how important communication is when doing anything with esports production. For the sake of keeping each episode in this mini-series self-reliant, I'll restate it one more time. If you are at all serious about moving up in the world of production, you'll need to be able to work together with your fellow broadcast crew members in order to prevent as many technical difficulties as possible. Odds are you won't be hosting, streaming, and casting a game all by yourself. Only crazy people do that. In most production crews you'll be starting out in, you'll have at the very least a lobby host to handle the in-game settings and two casters for live commentary over the broadcast. Generally, you'll be handling the live streams and camera work yourself, but once you gain more experience and move up to more established crews, you may find yourself in the position of the observer or observer separately. Producers are the ones who will be handling the stream overlays to make sure all of the information is accurate and the correct graphics are showing up at the appropriate times, whereas observers are literally the camera operators. Again, you'll usually be doing both of these tasks at the same time for smaller communities communities, since their stream setups are generally a lot simpler. It's not until you gain a bit of experience that you will likely be invited to a broadcast team that has you take on just one responsibility, mostly because the quality of standards for those roles are a lot higher when that's the only thing you're responsible for. As the producer of a stream, you're going to be the glue that connects all the loose pieces of a broadcasted game and turns it into a well-oiled machine. You will need to make sure that the lobby host is aware of when the production crew is ready to enter the game itself, give the casters any necessary information they might need before or during the broadcast, and let any separate observers know what kind of camera angles you want for the best possible experience for the viewers. You'll need to be muted on the broadcasting software you're using to make sure that when you whisper information during the action, the stream will only hear the casters. There is a subtle art to this kind of communication as well. You don't want to interrupt the caster's flow, but you also need to make sure that they're aware of any information that's important. It's a bit easier to say when they're on and off the air because they'll be waiting for those callouts from you, but I would personally recommend waiting for the transition between play-by-play to the color caster right after the fight stops to tell them anything mid-game. I found this to be the best time to catch their attention, though you will have to make the message quick and concise to ensure the color caster isn't waiting too long to get their word in before the action resumes. While you as a producer will be responsible for managing technical difficulties with the stream should they arise mid-broadcast, most production crews will have a handbook or another production staff on hand to assist you if needed, so I won't be going into the specific kinds of problems you might come across or how to handle them. Just pay attention to whatever instructions are given by the production heads you're working with in those cases. They know their system better than what I could attempt to explain in broad strokes. What I do want to emphasize, however, is that you will have to take some time before the live stream starts to make sure the caster's audio levels are fine. This point can also technically be included in the previous section about preparation, but there's a few different ways to go about adjusting caster's audio, most of which involve communication more than something you can easily do by yourself. The simplest way to adjust the audio is to turn them up individually in Discord or whatever application you're using to collect their microphone feeds. However, this doesn't always fix everything. Sometimes you will need to have the casters turn up their mics from their end, in which case it's a delicate balancing act in finding that perfect range for when they're audible without overpowering the rest of the stream. Once you find the settings that work for you, make a note of them, because odds are you'll be working with those casters again at some point in the future. In regards to the observing side of this role, there's less likely going to be direct communication with the casters and more of a dance to where you try to play off what each other is doing to show the audience the most complete picture possible. Most smaller communities will have you all present in the game lobby itself, so you will have to talk with the casters briefly before the start of the stream to see what they usually like to cover about the action versus what you like to spectate. If the casters are in the game lobby separately, I would recommend listening to them and spectating the rough outline of their narration. If they aren't in the game lobby but rather watching through your feed, they're going to be more at your whim as to what they watch, so try to give them the smoothest vantage point of the action possible. There's very little that a camera operator can do worse than spectate something completely unrelated to whatever the casters are talking about, and this is one of the biggest disconnects for the audience. If you're doing your job correctly, it's very easy for a viewer to become completely immersed in the show you're putting on for them, but the opposite is also true. It will likely take quite a bit of time to perfect the fluidity of your observing, so don't feel bad about small mistakes. Just keep moving on and try not to make the same mistake twice in the same broadcast. The vast majority of what you'll be doing during games itself will be revolving around the various camera angles you can take. Your main priority for this should be to show as much as possible, while still allowing the audience to feel like they're in the game themselves. You want the viewer to forget they're watching a live stream and allow them to give their full attention to your broadcast. Believe me when I say that bad camera work can break that immersion faster than just about anything else. The general rule of thumb I like to give observers in League Zero is that everything you do should include slow, sweeping camera movements. There are usually dozens of angles you can take to show the exact same fight adequately enough, and choosing which specific one you like the most will be within your creative freedom for the most part. As the game progresses, it will constantly morph around the map, requiring you to move around to keep the best view of what's going on. Again, while you will have plenty of room to develop your own style, I would highly recommend that whatever you do is done as smoothly as possible. Obviously, there's basic keybinds for Overwatch as spectator that you want to familiarize yourself with, specifically the F1 through 12 keys automatically assigned to the 12 players currently playing. Usually the tanks, DPS, and supports will have designated places in their lineup, meaning that you can have a consistent idea of what roles will be on which keybinds, though it is worth noting that each community may position their players in the lobby slightly differently compared to everyone else, so that's something you want to take note of if you're a producer, and ask about if you're an observer. Another important keybind I personally use a ton would be the shift key. By default, this is bound to the camera setting that allows the camera to zip around the map at a breakneck speed, but I always unbind that entirely entirely in order to rebind it to the slow camera setting. It's more comfortable for me to hold down the shift key compared to the control key that the slow camera is on by default, and in all honesty, you're never going to find an appropriate time to use the fast camera. If you really need to go somewhere across the map faster than the normal camera speed, just use the F keys to spectate a player nearby the action you want. Many production crews will often recommend that their observers use controllers so that the camera speed is easier to control, and so that you can have more range when it comes to these slow, sweeping camera motions that look so good on stream. Personally, I've never found much use for the controller, mostly because you will find yourself still needing to use a keyboard alongside it for certain keybinds that just won't fit onto the button mapping. The F keys are the most notable example of this. Larger productions like the Overwatch League utilize a small army of observers all at once to deal with this, but assuming you're working with a single camera setup, it gets a bit trickier. It is worth noting that all of the footage in the background for the past minute or so has been from games that I've personally streamed during the most recent season of League Zero, done completely with mouse and keyboard. It doesn't take much skill to be able to move your mouse in a way that looks practically indistinguishable from a joystick, the one downside being that you will eventually run out of space to pan in any given direction. I have a larger mouse pad and I'm always focusing a few camera motions ahead of where I'm currently when streaming, but this may prove more difficult if you play on a higher sensitivity or have a small desk. Ultimately, I would say it's up to you for whether you want to learn how to quickly swap from controller to keyboard as needed, or just use the plain old keyboard and mouse. The major contrast between the two styles are primarily that the controller gives you a better free cam spectating shots, but looks very clumsy in hectic fights, whereas using a mouse and keyboard limits your free cam range to however clever you can be with the space you have, while giving you a lot of control to weave through cluttered action. Until you get around a legitimate professional level, the choice is going to be up to you for the most part. A general guide of when I would use free cam versus first person perspectives would be as follows. Try to use the free cam viewing to give a wide angle of the map and how teams are setting up for the upcoming fight. Before the action officially starts, there's nothing in first person that's worth watching quite yet, so that would be the time better spent showing where and how the action is shaping up. Once the fight breaks out, you can go to first person perspective to give a up close and personal view of everything. The audience will be more familiar with this vantage point since that's what they see in game, which allows them to connect to big plays more. If a fight breaks out in a tight corridor, or when you're in a meta where there's just a ton of particle effects being thrown around to the point where you're just seeing a giant rainbow on screen, I would recommend going back to free cam spectating until you find a perspective from a player that can actually see what's going on. To put it simply, no one enjoys watching a Reinhardt try to swing at random colors on his screen when there's an Orisa shield, Symmetra wall, Coalescence, May Blizzard all going off at once. There is also the possibility of the third person view while spectating a specific player, but I've found that this angle is completely useless if I'm being honest. It forces the camera into a claustrophobic sightline right up behind the character's shoulder, and it misses all of the charm and connection that goes along with the first person perspective you see when you play the game for yourself. I'd just skip past this view entirely. There are better angles you can capture than this not close up. When in the middle of a fight, you want to be careful about how often you're changing perspectives. You definitely don't want to stick to one random player for an entire fight, that would just get boring quickly, but you also don't want to skip around every 5 seconds. I don't have an approximation for how long you should spectate a player for, because that's going to vary depending on the hero you're watching as well as the meta. Even then, it can vary depending on what the teams are playing. Fortunately, you shouldn't have to think too hard about which players to spectate, because the play-by-play caster should be doing their job and narrating the most important parts of the fight. Assuming they're in the lobby to view the game for themselves, you should be following along with whatever they're saying to show the viewers what the casters are talking about. If the casters are just watching your feed from the game, then you should already have communicated with the casters about what kind of angles they want to see most, as we discussed earlier. This is by far the area of streaming/observing that has the most room for personal expression, as every good camera operator has their own style and approach to showing the game on stream. As you get more comfortable observing, you will start to get a feel for what works best for you, and that is really what separates the good from the great. This final point will admittedly be shorter, and has a fair amount of bleed over from the general idea of having good camera work in the first place. However, I think it is important enough to warrant its own separate mention. It's rather simple when you boil it down in regards to what you should be viewing in the game itself. You should always have some kind of action on screen. This action can take the form of just about anything. For 90% of the broadcast, this will be the teams fighting for the objective control, so that will be easy enough to figure out where you should be. But there are smaller periods of time at the start of each map or round where the teams are are stuck in their spawns or still selecting their heroes. This is one of those periods of time that I firmly believe separates the good from the mediocre in regards to observers that can think on their feet. My rule of thumb is that you should always have something moving on screen, even if it's the camera itself that's moving. In Overwatch League, they tend to have set positions for each map where they can view a variety of scenery in the background that's usually overlooked, though I also fear that a lot of amateurs look at that and fail to understand why it works for the Overwatch League and not them. I can't tell you how many times I've seen first-time observers in League 0 staring at a random statue or a plaque on the wall for the entire setup phase of a map. The scenery is nice and all, but keep in mind that you're producing a live stream, not taking a screenshot. By their very nature, a statue or the side of a building are not going to move, so if you want to show those parts of the map off, at least slowly pan the camera to give the stream some life. Certain maps like Rialto will have structures like the boats driving through the canals to give a more appealing scene to stare at while the spawn doors are yet to open, so take advantage of any of these if you're dead set on showing the scenery off. What I like to do personally during the setup phase is slowly swing the camera around on a little journey from the defender's first spawn all the way to the attacker's first spawn. If I get to the attack spawn before the gates open, I will always be there after the players can choose their heroes, meaning that they're going to be dancing around while they wait. Some teams will perform a little spawn ritual for the cameras on rare occasions, and at the very least it's enough movement to keep the viewers engaged for the remaining few seconds before the action will start in earnest. Just like with the general camera tips I gave earlier, there's a lot of stylistic flexibility here, and there's certainly no one right way to go about it. Just make sure that there's some movement, and be careful to not shimmy the camera back and forth like you're trying to spectate a scrim or something. That kind of goes back to the fast camera movements no-no from before, but I want to bring it up again. While the stream is receiving your camera feed of the game, you are responsible for keeping the viewing experience as smooth as possible. And that's just about everything in regards to the basics for streaming/observing in Overwatch Esports. Unfortunately, it wouldn't do any good to go in-depth on how to use OBS or other common broadcasting tools. Like I said before, each production crew has their own way of doing things. Some places have a very simplistic streaming kit and are incredibly easy to get the hang of, whereas other crews may have extremely complex setups. Hell, the kit we had for League Zero's most recent season was so complex that it looked borderline professional, at the cost of having around 4 consistent volunteers who were capable of using it, 3 of which were League admins. The more useful tips I can give you in a general sense are all the points I stated earlier about communication and how to keep your camera feed as smooth as possible. Whatever production crew or crews you end up working with will be able to give you more in-depth guides on specific things like streaming kits and OBS settings they want out of you. As long as you can stream Overwatch at like 720p with a consistent 60 FPS, most smaller production crews would be happy to have you. In regards to where you can go to join production crews, there are plenty of smaller communities like Flux Cup, Owlet, or even the crew I run in League Zero. I just listed in order from the least to most complex streaming kits, but in all honesty, even our one in League Zero isn't so complicated that you couldn't get the hang of it with just a little bit of effort put in. Once you work your way up the ranks and want to try something a little more professional, you may want to try out for actual companies that offer unpaid work as experience, such as Elo Hell, Monkey Bubble, or Reflash, though again that's mostly for people who have some experience already, so those would be more of a reach goal for you for the time being, unless you're really good right out of the gates. There is also one more community I'd like to mention. They aren't so much of a production crew as much as a Discord server based in general esports production. It's called broadcast.gg, and they have hundreds of production people from various esports titles that can congregate in one place to discuss their craft. It's probably one of the best places you can go for advice on how to improve, and the server staff even hold the occasional workshop with legitimate professionals to coach people just starting out such as yourselves. I'll have the links to the smaller communities as well as broadcast.gg in the description for anyone interested in finding their start. If you have any questions about anything you feel I missed, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I'll try my best to get back to you in a timely manner. I will also have each segment of this video timestamped in case you want a refresher on a particular aspect of streaming/observing. And that's pretty much it in this mini-series for the time being. I don't have any more episodes or topics planned at the moment. While there are other positions in esports production, most of them are expansions of either casting or producing, or even just flat out require different skills like organization, content creation, or social media management. If you would like to see a video on those topics, feel free to suggest them in the comments. Otherwise, that's all I've got. So until next time, don't die.